Welcome to the second annual Sovereign Radio. I'm your host, Chang and Chang. I'm here with Jim, the co-founder of Catalyst. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, actually, welcome back to another interview with me. I had you on at Entertain FM. That was our first interview together where I met Jim, and it was a fantastic interview. So I'm glad to have you back on a podcast together.
Yeah, glad to do it in person. The vibe's always better in person, I feel like.
It definitely is, yeah. Okay, so Catalyst, you gave a talk at Modular Summit. Why don't you bring the audience with us about your talk?
Sure. So it was a pretty high-level talk, I would say. It was basically just mapping out kind of like a diverging path that we have, where in the future we're going to see millions of chains enabled by the modular blockchain stack. And if we kind of let things be as is, we're kind of going down a path of modular chaos, like lots of chains, lots of fragmentation, very terrible user experience. But if we all coordinate, we can go to modular utopia, which is like chain abstraction and this like kind of very aligned, like seamless experience that we're all trying to build. And kind of where like the bottlenecks of like getting us to that utopia, basically. And of course, I have to talk about Catalyst, right? One of the major bottlenecks that we see is actually allowing solvers or more solvers to participate in like the chain abstraction stack. I mean, I'm jumping a few rings, but basically, allowing more of these like off-chain like agents to participate allows more kind of like openness and also more price kind of effectiveness of actually like allowing chain abstraction to happen such that we can have this like glorious like no chain experience, right? So that was kind of like the high level overview of it.
Awesome. I'm going to bring us back a few steps to give the audience some context. If they don't know what solvers are or chain abstraction is, can you explain those concepts?
Yeah, so chain abstraction is, fancy word, right? For like stuff that we've already been doing for years.
We like to get cute in crypto.
Yeah, we like catchphrases.
Yeah, chain abstraction, ABS, modularity.
Yeah.
And
so, I mean, like it's kind of like in the word, right? But it's like, I think now we're at the phase where, we know there's not just going to be one chain, right? It's not just Ethereum or what have you. There's a lot of chains, right? And they all look really different. It's like some chains are on top of another. We call them roll-ups, or some of them are by themselves, or some of them share the same, security properties. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, there's like a lot of them, right? And it's become very confusing for people to choose which chain they want to be on. And so there's been kind of a push to abstract that away, right? And so how do we add this kind of interstitial, like middle layer that allows, that kind of covers away that complexity and it only exposes what's necessary to not only like end users, but also like application developers, right? And so that's kind of like chain abstraction in a nutshell. Sorry, you asked about solvers. And so the interstitial layer is composed of like a number of actors, which one of them are like solvers, right? Which are basically, again, another fancy word, right? But a way for like users to express like what they want. Like, oh, I want to, like earn yield, right? I want to make money on my existing money. And then solvers basically take that idea and like implement it on chain through like it might be like a variety of transactions, right? On different chains. And so they kind of are like the shield or like the butlers of sorts of users.
Yes. So just to give everyone a little sanity check about where we are in the technology adoption phase, the conversation now is around chain abstraction and these sorts of like this sort of higher level infrastructure, because before in 2017, when the worldview was everything is going to be running on one single monolithic chain, which is Ethereum, turns out the Cosmos thesis says, no, it's actually going to be a multi-blockchain, multi-ecosystem world where there's going to be thousands to millions of blockchains potentially, maybe not millions.
I think so.
Okay, sure. But it's ultimately going to end up as the internet of blockchains. There's going to be a networked set of blockchains. So now that after all these years, there was a Cambrian explosion of these different chains, now we're talking about a higher level layer that then standardizes and aggregates the chain state of all of these underlying chains.
Yeah.
So we're now moving towards what Andreas Andreas Antonopoulos is talking about. I had Andreas Antonopoulos on Interchain FM. He was the first guest I've had on the podcast, and he was talking about how the Web3 space is going to trend in the direction how Web2 evolved from Web1, right?
Yeah.
Web1 was all these different various protocols, Cambridge explosion of protocols. Web2 evolved because standardization happened, and then now this like higher level layer of like websites are able to use those standard protocols to be able to join as like this network set of websites and like
Yeah.
servers and whatnot. So now we're kind of in that phase of standardization. A lot of people still complain about how Web3 applications are still not consumer facing. Well, I'm like, well, look at where we are now, right? We're not there yet. We don't have standardization yet. And so we're at that point where we're figuring out standardization and like aggregation before the next killer application, like the next Facebooks or whatever, is built on top of this infrastructure in a scalable
precisely.
way.
Yeah. Like, I'm glad you bring up like Web 2. Like, and I think like YouTube and Netflix are like really, really good examples, because I don't think anyone really asks like how like their videos like delivered to their screen. But like the TLDR is like, there are like servers that host information. And there's actually these like intermediary nodes called like content delivery networks that like kind of like cache that information. And they're available to you like locally in different like geographical locations, such that you can like get it quicker, right? And so that's why everyone's always pissed where they're like, oh, my internet connection is really bad, but I get my ads, but I can't load my YouTube video. And they think there's like some like conspiracy theory of like serving you ads. It's just that the ads are like literally like physically closer to your computer than the actual video is, right? But all that like gets abstracted, right? Using these things called like overlay networks. And we're kind of in that phase, right? Where it's like, you can't make a YouTube or a Netflix without these overlay networks. And so we need to build the Web3 version of those in order for these like amazing applications or amazing experiences to come to light.
So given that, let's talk about Catalyst. Where does Catalyst fit into this paradigm?
Yeah, so Catalyst is effectively a way for chains to unify liquidity between one another. And so, in kind of the current state that we see right now, new blockchain means new liquidity, right? Like they have to get USDC in somehow, or they have their own native token, or what have you, right? Everything's very like zero sum. What Catalyst does is it allows for the sharing and the unification of liquidity between other chains, right? And so they're able to access the liquidity of other chains the same way as if they were native assets of the chain itself. And so that leads to a lot of like capital efficiency in the system, and also decreases a lot of the fragmentation that we're seeing. And so if you're a new chain or a new rollup and you want to like bootstrap a whole ecosystem, you don't need to painstakingly like pull USDC from other places and like embed it into yours. You can simply just leverage their USDC for your users. And so instead of having like a couple $100,000 of money kind of floating around your small app, you now have access to billions, right? And so that's kind of like the high level thesis of what Catalyst enables. It's a cross-chain application that allows for the access of that liquidity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that cross-chain application, because how is it implemented such that it enables this end goal?
Sure. So Catalyst effectively is 3 pieces, right? And so the first piece are vaults where assets are stored, right? And so there's assets that live on Polygon, assets that live on Ethereum, right? These are the native assets that I was talking about. Underneath that is what we call like a value coordination system that allows these assets to be effectively like accessed by other chains, right? You can, said more fancily, it's like a state synchronization system, right? But trying not to use too technical words, too fancy words right now. And then underneath that is basically like a data communication system, right? And we actually outsource that to a number of other interoperability protocols like Layer 0 and Wormhole and IBC, for example, such that we can use chains that have like different ways that they want to communicate, right? Like Cosmos chains for IBC and rollups for Wormhole and Layer 0, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you deposit, okay, so let's go back to the structure. So when you deposit assets into the vaults, now you're able to access So that's the first layer. And the second layer, now you're able to access those assets. Well, how are you actually accessing them through this, state synchronization, or this data synchronization issue, is actually using these like various cross-chain communication protocols. So that's like effectively what it is in a nutshell.
Right. So these vaults, who is providing the liquidity, and are there incentives for providing liquidity?
So the vaults can be accessed or can be like deposited by anyone, really. But that's not a very helpful answer, right? And so like we typically see like 3 archetypes of depositors. So the first is like retail, like end users, kind of like lay people. The second piece is institutional. So we're talking about more like hedge funds or liquid funds at this point. The third piece is actually the chains themselves, right? And so chains want to get access to other liquidity. Well, they kind of need to front their own liquidity first, right? And so they'll do that to bootstrap the pools, right? And so those are kind of like the 3 like differences that we see.
It seems like Catalyst has built more of a currency exchange store for different. If a chain is a different country, let's say, and each country has their own fiat currencies. If I'm this new, let's say, country, Liberia or something, don't yet have my own native currency, but I do want to import, or I do have my own native currency, but it's not really heavily used, and I want travelers to come through. So let's say I have European travelers. I need a storefront to exchange currency, for, like the euro to my, my Liberian dollars or something. I would imagine that Catalyst is sort of the currency exchange in here and in Europe or something like that. And then you just provide the exchange routing and orchestration, let's just say.
Yeah, I think that's like certainly one facet of Catalyst. I would say, and I think that's a really good analogy, right? I think like to take the existing analogy further, I think we see it less as like tourists coming to the country and exchanging currencies, and more of actually like a trade agreement between the actual countries. Right.
Also, like trade agreement, the central bank of Liberia and the central bank
Yeah.
of the EU.
Yeah, exactly. It's
IMF.
like they need to establish like liquid FX markets between each other in order to enable that, right? And then you can have the currency shops like leverage that liquidity effectively.
Okay.
But Catalyst is also like the liquidity like venue. But we also invite, and we're working with other partners like aggregators like Li-Fi and Socket to also be like currency providers effectively.
Right.
Yeah.
So where does the need for an AMM arise? Because I would imagine it is the way that you're transferring the assets to and from, it requires some kind of a DEX or some kind. Again, I don't like using idiosyncratic nomenclature, but kind of like the AMM is sort of figuring out intents, right? Or limit orders, or like the correct pricing for whatever asset they're trying to transfer over.
Yeah. So again, like I kind of like outline what Catalyst looks like in like a really general sense, like the 3 abilities or the three parts of the stack. So I would say the AMM kind of lives in that middle area where it's like you're allowing value to coordinate between one another, right? And so one way that can happen, and this is where Catalyst is like on its V1 stage, is through a very simple AMM, right? And so you have these vaults of assets, and they're able to swap against each other using effectively like a cross-chain AMM curve. That being said, we're thinking really deeply about like, what does it look like to generalize that, right? You don't necessarily need to leverage the AMM, so to speak. And this is where solvers come in, right? Solvers can build their own strategies such that they can provide like that liquidity or the value coordination without using the AMM, or they use the AMM afterwards, right? And so if these solvers hold inventory, they're able to basically offer these swaps more like as an RFQ-like system. And then what they use the AMM for is more for like a cross-chain inventory coordination mechanism, right? And so when we look at it from like a like a chain abstraction perspective, I think you use this word like at the top, like intents, right? It's kind of like the nice buzzword that we use for like what users want. And so you have that top layer, you have like the solver layer, all these off-chain agents. And at the bottom, you have this like, they call it like settlement, but I basically call it like the reimbursement layer. It's like these solvers are fronting money to do things for users. Well, how do they get paid afterwards? And that's kind of like the settlement layer. And that's where like the Catalyst AMM comes in.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. All right. And if you enjoyed this highlight reel, please do take a look at Jim's talk at Modular Summit. And with that, we're going to wrap up. If you want a further primer and a deep dive into Catalyst AMM, I did do a podcast with Jim that I alluded to earlier, and it's on Interchain FM. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for joining Sovereign Radio.
Thanks for having me. Had a bunch of fun.